Welcome to Lesche, a podcast on new ideas in ancient Greek studies. I'm your host, Johanna Hanning, and I'm a classicist at Brown University. I remember that when I was little, I was always drawn to that New Testament parable about the two builders, the one who builds his house on stone and the other who builds his house on the sand. What did it mean, I wondered, to build a house on sand? Was building on sand always necessarily a bad thing? Was a house built on sand kind of like the house built of sticks in the Big Bad Wolf story? Or was there something more to the notion of where the house was built, on the beach, I always assumed, as opposed to what it was built with? The parable is, of course, about foundations, about what supports our belief systems and our lives. But even as a child, I sense that there is something more literal at stake in that image or in that conceit. There's something about the sand itself, the shore, the threshold between the land and the sea. Ancient peoples, of course, knew something about building on sand and about what it meant to live and think at that threshold between land and sea. And in his new book, The Ancient Shore, Paul Kosmin reveals how the coastline was not merely a setting for ancient events, but a singular kind of space that shaped the cosmology, mythology, politics, inner lives, trade systems, economies, etc., of the Greeks and their neighbors. The shore was where state power ended and where human limitation began, a kind of site of infinite possibility, but also profound humility. It was fundamental to ancient theories of sovereignty, central to philosophical and scientific inquiry, and integral to myth and all sorts of forms of artistic expression. Paul's ancient coastal network is vast, connecting the Atlantic to the Straits of Malacca, and his approach is equally expansive, weaving together statecraft and commerce with intellectual, literary, religious, and environmental history. The Ancient Shore, which won the American Historical Association Prize in History prior to CE 1000, offers us a radically new way of understanding the ancient world along the messy, ever-shifting, and yet abiding edges where land meets sea. It's also beautifully written. In the end, despite the risks, the sand can be a very interesting place to build, live, think, and wonder. And as Paul's book wonderfully demonstrates, people have known that for a very long time. Paul Kosmin completed his undergraduate degree at Oxford and earned a PhD in ancient history from Harvard University in 2012. He was appointed an assistant professor in Harvard's classics department in 2012, was tenured in 2019, and in 2020 became the Philip J. King Professor of Ancient History. He is currently serving as interim chair of the department. His research focuses on the political and cultural history of the ancient Greek world, and in particular, he concentrates on the globalizing and colonial Hellenistic period. Just a quick note that, as ever, I've put a few references in the show notes for this episode. I'm also going to be posting an image to accompany the episode on the Lesche Instagram account, which is at Lesche Podcast. That's where I post announcements about new episodes. So if you're on Instagram, you might want to follow the podcast there. Now, I'd like to welcome into the Lesche Paul Kosmin. The next voice you'll be hearing is his.
So the book represents something of a turn in my own work, away from the study of a single state and an imperial culture. That was my previous two books were on the Seleucid Empire. I wanted to move to something that was not as contained geographically or chronologically. And I was also really interested in essentially how we reckon with the environment historically. So there's a sort of intellectual origin for the book. There's also a more personal one in that I've always loved the shore, the coast. I was really fortunate to spend quite a lot of my childhood in a small village on the south coast of England called Fairlight, which actually appears in the book. I've got a memory of it. And just a deep love of kind of the rock pools and the light and the sounds and smells of the shore. And then also a real sense of the sort of historical agency of the sea. I mean, this was a village which essentially was like falling over the cliff as the sea eroded the base. And there was this effort, frankly heroic, by the villagers to construct a berm, like a cedar fence, that would stop this. And it was a very strong sense of the destructive force of nature there, in some senses, it's a bit like a bourgeois village's version of a combat myth of order versus chaos. And yet also the wonder that erosion brought out. The memory in the book that I draw on is of, as a kid, with my brothers climbing down the cliff one day and finding sort of bevy of paleontologists pouring, I guess, plaster of Paris into sort of indents on the rocks. And it was the footprints of iguanodons. And it just totally blew my mind that this kind of landscape looked completely different many million years ago, millions of years ago, with these creatures large as double-decker buses walking over a river plain. And now it's the shore. So this big sense of like deep time, the violence of nature and human attempts to order it, the guiding questions behind it.
Well, as you say that, it strikes me that there's something about, and you certainly meditate on this in the book, but the shore as a site of intensive activity, but also a lot of erasure. I guess what I'm getting at is, and I think, you bring this out in the book, is there's a kind of doing and undoing and redoing and kind of recursiveness that I guess poetically like mimics the waves lapping at the shore or something, that kind of site.
Yeah, totally. And I think it's something I'm quite interested in the book and beyond is the limits of history that appear in a place like this, the possibilities of trans-historical rhyme or pattern. Yeah, I mean, in the book's introduction, I frame it as the shoreline, I think, is a particularly sort of historically generative kind of place because it combines the kind of the human building of the world with the environmental lack of heed towards that. I call it the global and the planetary after Chakrabarti. And like the shore is the place where these two overlap and become visible, culturally visible in a way that I can't think any other location does.
So I think that there's a paragraph or two that appears very early in your introduction where you set out why this, what you call the coastal zone, was so central to life in the ancient world. Maybe could you read those for listeners?
So this is on pages 2 and 3. The coastal zone was central to the economic, political, and social dynamics of the ancient Mediterranean and West Asia, and to the inner life of their inhabitants. The shore was the single most significant setting in antiquity for cultural contact, interregional mobility, trade, and predation. Its double-facedness, inviting reciprocity, reversibility, and tit for tat. It was a cosmopolitan, transcultural landscape where, as Herodotus indicates, the laborers of distant coasts and the residents of different seas were brought together and estranged. Permeable and open to violence, it was where territorial sovereignty was most vulnerable and so asserted with particular ostentation. Its contrast of elements anchored the most basic geographical imagination and attracted a substantial literary, artistic, and scientific attention. To a remarkable and underappreciated degree, the history of antiquity, of a wider Greek antiquity in particular, from the Homeric epics to Hellenistic explorations, is a coastal story. At the same time, the ancient shore was where these efforts of communal ordering and intellectual fabrication met the raw, unassimilated environment most continuously and maximally. It was, and perhaps remains, the primary location for orienting ourselves to a natural world that is given to us without being intended for us. Tempests, tsunami, tides, erosion, flooding, slow and sudden landscape change. The shore draws us into conference with forces that precede and surpass all human measure, and thereby into attempts to contain and make meaning of this exorbitance and indifference. If the garden has since antiquity been the symbol site of a proud humanity's subordination of the natural world, or less ambitiously, of its choreography of the tame and the wild, then the shore would be its antithesis, a disorderly, anti-rational place, dominated by the unbiddable integrity of an eternal sea, and exposing the vanity of all mortal pretensions. To borrow Jean-Didier Urbain's formulation, the coast is a, quote, kingdom of non-events, permitting no accumulation of achievements, tumbling all sequence in the cycle of its tides, and resisting domestication. In Ovid's reading, it's as if the literal landscape has a geography, but not a history, it's where we walk without footprints.
So Ovid, they're referring to the Ars Amatoria passage in which we find Ulysses drawing Troy and then having the waves crash and devastate his sandcastle, as it were. You mentioned Herodotus in that passage, and one of the observations that you make is that for Herodotus and then for us as readers who have Herodotus as our first historiographical record from antiquity, I mean, history begins at the shore, the famous story of the abduction of Helen with the Phoenician pirates and so on and so forth. I guess going back to your account of how this project came to be, I'm wondering, what were the first points of contact between your personal experience and your personal memories of the shore and the ancient material that is your professional life? Like, how did these kind of connections start to come together? Were there things that you noticed in reading or rereading the ancient material, or were there memories that actually then kind of conjured up ancient passages or ancient evidence for you? How did those two parts of yourself intertwine, I guess, in the course of this project?
So not in any direct or obvious way, I think. Partly it is through sort of experiences of travel. I mean, the Herodotus passage you mentioned, one of the reasons I love it and I begin with it is because the Phoenicians come from the Erythraean Sea in this. And it already leads into a multi-sea ancient world. I mean, one of these, so this is a more disciplinary answer than a personal answer, but I'll go there after. One of the things that I wanted to do in this book is, in a sense, to push against the Mediterraneanism that was so helpful in the emergence of ancient history as a discipline. It's the first historiographic sea. It's allowed us narratives of kind of connection and connectivity beyond the boundaries of particular individual states, but it still has often Greek and Roman as its equivalent, or the Roman Empire as its telos or explanandum. And even just in that passage by Herodotus, the Phoenicians migrating from one sea to another, it's a big world, it's a global world, a cosmopolitan one, and bringing the worlds of the Indian Ocean and the Atlantic into the picture, I think was one of the main motivations. I had some of the ideas for the book in southern India when I was interested. The first chapter is about the opening up of the Indian Ocean world to Greek and Hellenistic exploration, and really understanding the Ptolemaic and Seleucid mega-kingdoms as land bridges between two seas, and actually thought that it was going to be a book on the Indian Ocean. And that kind of started as chapter one, and it was very much through sort of seeing sites in southern India, especially the shore temple at Mamallapuram, and seeing the sort of integration of the tidal rise and fall into that, and then being reminded of sort of the importance of like hearing out the tide tables when I was going to the beach as a kid. I mean, the Mediterranean is super weird. It doesn't have this. It doesn't have this kind of rhythm that links you to the sun and the moon and has a kind of interplanetary solar system thing to it. So that was one place where the personal, the travel, the memories, the ideas all did come together.
Yeah, I was hoping you could actually speak a little bit more about, I mean, it's a very broad history. There's this kind of history of a concept, but one of the things that you point out is that you're not telling a story of some major transition or some huge catastrophic or whatever the opposite of catastrophic change is. It's a sort of layered history that I think poetically mirrors the object of your study. But could you speak a little bit more, about where you feel the geographical and kind of temporal heart of things is in the book, if there is one? So you already mentioned India, and the first of the three chapters is about what you designate as the Southern Sea, which, as you were suggesting, might surprise people who are expecting the Aegean or the Mediterranean or something. Yep. But you also make some claims about how this could also be read as a contribution to Hellenistic intellectual history. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the centers of gravity, maybe, in terms of the period and geography.
Yes, it's in a world of sea and land. coast is just a pattern into which the whole world falls. So there are obviously coasts everywhere, but the coast is also really young. It's been in a sort of where it is now only for about the last 5,000 to 6,000 years, which happens to also be the period that we consider traditionally historical. And then within that period, where we have the Greek world, obviously it's the Greek and especially Hellenistic world is where my own interests lie. It's also a world that produces an incredibly rich archive of engagements with the shore. My interest is particularly on the Hellenistic period within this, partly because it is a moment of what in the book I call thickening. It's not a from to story, but it is one of sort of an increasing claim on the imagination by the shoreline. And it's partly because this is a sort of a big bang moment in which Greek and Macedonian ships enter the worlds of ocean like they never have before, where the scale of ancient history, Greek ancient history, becomes homologous with that of Near Eastern history, and at the grandest a kind of Afro-Eurasian scale of history writing, when Greek history truly becomes a history of empire in the sense of ruling over ethnically discrete and distinct non-Greek populations, and that being an emphasized part of the polity, when there's a whole host of new cultural changes. I guess I've increasingly become interested in the sort of triangle of political power, science and structured and intellectual thought, and the environment. And this seems to come to a head in this period of thickening.
Before we move into the body chapters, I guess there's one last question I wanted to ask you, which is in your introduction, you spend some time, I think very well spent, on discussing, I guess, what you call modern coastal studies. I'm sure there's
the new coastal history.
The new coastal history, okay. I'm surprised there's not a fancier Greek-derived name for this. But I was wondering if you could maybe articulate here how the new coastal history shaped the way that you were approaching the ancient evidence. I was especially interested in your discussion of the scholarship and the discourse on how humans have turned coasts into coastline.
So that I think there is some really very exciting scholarship on the modern coast, the new coastal history, as it's called, and identify two sort of fundamental narratives, basic stories that are told. One is the hardening of the shoreline, the way that something that's kind of fuzzy is denatured, rationalized, turned into a line, coast into coastline, as you say. And then the other very closely related sort of de-savaging of the coastline, transformations of the people who live on the shore into good national or imperial subjects of inland or hegemonic power. They're very, very exciting works, and especially the latter in recent years.
Yeah, could I just note that you gave a really nice shout out to my colleague at Brown, Bathsheba Demuth's work on the Bering Strait.
I think Floating Coast was really something that it was one of the sort of intellectual inspirations for this project. It's really I think it's one of the best pieces of environmental history writing that I know. Beautifully written, cleverly crafted, dealing in really complicated but well thought through ways with the entanglement of sort of animals, humans, empires, indigenous populations. It's great. And also I would say Greg Denning's work in the Marquesas Islands in the Pacific have been extremely helpful in thinking this through. I mean, both narratives are extremely stimulating. They don't really work for antiquity in quite the same way, partly because they're, as in standard narratives of modernization, they work by, they require the novelties of modernity require pushing everything pre-modern into a kind of flat basement. There's huge amounts of prefiguring of their arguments in antiquity. And then also there is, as I think in much environmental history, a kind of almost a theological undergirding to them. The overreach of humanity producing a punishment. I mean, they tend to be narratives of catastrophe, immiseration, environmental devastation, overreach, and punishment.
So you've mentioned that these modern works, which you admire and which you took some inspiration from, have this maybe necessary tendency to flatten the pre-modern world. You have a passage in your introduction that I think really helpfully articulates your own historical methodology, how to do history of the shore. Would you be willing to read that?
Sure.
It's
the ancient cults.
Sure.
I'm sorry, I didn't. You can delete that if you want.
That's okay. It was inevitable. Go ahead.
Yeah. To discuss the ancient coast in all these ways will set us, at least in part and by necessity, in the mode of a mounding descriptive empiricism. It will require a kind of slowing down, a coming to a pause on this too quickly crossed threshold, in order to look about the shore, take in its plenitude, and assemble our archive. Of course, not all phenomena can be included. It's not necessary to investigate everything in order to understand something, and I prefer to dwell longer upon some of the lesser studied topics. But in its bringing together of typically disaggregated materials, the book seeks both to assert the coherence of this edge world and also to resist the rending of an originally integrated ancient reality into different scholarly domains and discourses. It's a project of unification, joining together in the examination of one particular kind of place, economic and social history, accounts of statecraft and sovereignty, intellectual, literary, and religious studies, and the environmental humanities. This is a claim not only to a historical wholeness, or the necessary integration of practices and ideas and environments, or even the co-constitution of the human and the natural in a landscape, for all of which the book argues. It is, at heart, proposing a kind of marginal centrality, like a swarm of iron filings that gather along a magnetic field and align to its polarity. There's a clustering, overlapping, entanglement, and emergent patterning of historical phenomena at the coastline. The edgeness and endness of the shore, the unassimilability of its planetary face, are not so much a limitation to history as a site of heat and friction that blazes with historical generativity and illuminates so many domains of human endeavor. The coast, much as the event horizon of astronomy, glows distinctly because things become invisible beyond. So that was really expressing the desire to do a kind of kaleidoscopic or multi-path history that tries to get at this object, the ancient shore, that I think really does exist as a distinctive domain of history with a particularly intense historical generativity from every side.
And in the introduction, you outline that the book is being structured according to three fundamental historical dynamics, which you call our discovery of likeness, number one. Number two, our claiming of place. And number three, our orientation to the natural world. And then you rephrase it to give the subject position to the coast, as you say, the first chapter then being how the shore linked up people, the second, how it provoked and resisted territorialization, and then the third one being how it prompted contemplation of the cosmos and our place within it. So if we could start at the beginning, and with this question of how the shore linked people. In this first chapter, you really do focus on the Southern Sea. And one of the concepts that you begin with is the concept of fish eaters. Could you explain what that means and why it's important in your study?
In the second half of the 2nd century BCE, a brilliant writer called Agatharchides of Cnidus wrote a 5-book account of the Southern Sea world, which he called On the Erythraean Sea. It's lost inevitably, but was paraphrased or quoted by Diodorus, Strait, basically lots of people. So we have a fairly extensive text. I think it's in fact our longest piece of Hellenistic Alexandrian prose. It's a really important text. It's amazing. It represents the accumulated knowledge of 2 centuries worth of Hellenistic and especially Ptolemaic exploration of the Red Sea, the Arabian Sea, and sort of the northern reaches of the Indian Ocean world. Reports of sailors and traders, Ptolemaic royal codifications of sailing, the journals of court-sponsored exploration missions. These was writing under Ptolemy VI and Ptolemy VIII, which is the period when, especially Ptolemy VIII, when the monsoon winds discovered by the Hellenistic world, by the Ptolemies. The fish eaters is the name he gives to a bunch of populations who lived along the shorelines of the Southern Sea, from the Gulf of Suez all the way to all the way to sort of India, and then later scholars would extend it to China. It's an amazing text. It's quite unlike any other description of the coasts that we have, which tend to emphasize difference, the periploy of the Mediterranean and Black Seas, for dividing up populations by name and city or ethnographic type. And the fish eaters, by contrast, according to Agatharchides, represent a kind of synthetic vision of ethnographic continuity. They are populations who live in the narrow environmental niche between the high tide and low tide mark on the tidal beach, and whose entire life revolves around essentially being born, living, and dying within this niche and exploiting it to the maximum. He represents them as timeless, as quote unquote primitive in their various different ways. And it's really this remarkable accumulation of it's people who manifest the processes of the coastal zone and almost become its sort of anthropomorphic type.
Well, in that chapter, there's also another very interesting case study about the way, in the way that the littoral zone sort of brings people together. But this is a sort of nesting doll of topographies, actually, that you bring up in the case of the island of Socotra with the Hawk Cave on it. Could you share for listeners a little bit sort of what you make of this case study, this island, off the east coast of the Horn of Africa, south of modern-day Yemen, that has a really interesting assemblage of artifacts that speak to these issues of how the coastline can generate a kind of likeness amongst human communities?
So Agatharchides essentially has two types of people in his work. He's got the fish eaters, who are the indigenous populations along the shore, who are timeless, static, and not mobile. And then he's got the people who describe them, who are they're the people with history in his view, the sailors and the Ptolemaic officials who do hit and run landings along their coast. At the end of the 2nd century BCE, just about the time Agatharchides was writing, the monsoon wind route to India was discovered, which made possible sailing not along the coast, but across the sort of the blue sea rather than the white sea, the open sea to India. And right in the middle of this route sits the island of Socotra. And in antiquity, in various sources from possibly the inspiration for Euhemerus's Pangaea Island, definitely in Agatharchides, very visibly in the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea from the 1st century CE, and a lot of other texts, is represented as an island of international meeting, where sailors from every coast of the Southern Sea meet, trade. There's even a Ptolemaic colony probably located on it. But this was solely textual. And then in the year 2000, Dutch speleologists, who were not ancient historians, but they were doing surveys of the caves on the island of Socotra. And in the cave called Hock, they came across a totally incredible set of evidence. The cave is about 2.5 kilometers long. For the first kilometer, it's just a cave with sort of impressive stalactites, stalagmites, flowstones, and so on. But for the last 1.5 kilometers, it's covered with ancient graffiti, drawings of ships, incense burners, shells. It's very clear that no one who's writing the graffiti was sort of expecting to when they went in, because they're like scratching things with a like broken off stalactite, or with just mud grabbed from the floor, or like the charcoal burnt end of a torch they were carrying. And these graffiti extend between, like, the first ones are probably 2nd century BCE, maybe 1st century BCE, and they last until the 5th century CE. And what's amazing about this site is just the number of languages that are depicted here. Most are South Asian, Brahmi, Kharoshthi. There's even one in Greco-Bactrian. But there's also South Arabian, Aksumite, Palmyrene Aramaic, and Greek. And what seems to be happening is you have merchants involved in the South Sea Ocean trade, particularly probably incense and spices, who land on the island enter this cave, and then in the kind of social act that graffiti prompts, copy other graffiti. But they said they will write their name on the cave wall. A couple of them, actually very interestingly, write their name in more than 2 scripts. So Aramaic and Greek, or Greco-Bactrian and Brahmi. They don't really give any information about themselves other than their name and their profession, that of sailor, captain, trader. Some of them refer to a god of the cave, but they don't name him. He remains unnamed, I think, so as to be common. And what we get, ultimately, I think, is a kind of not deliberate, but nonetheless kind of consequential international zone or meeting point in the middle of the sea, where these sailors are recognizing the sort of mutuality of a similarity of their professions and identities.
Yeah, you almost could imagine if they ever expand the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise to the Red Sea, that this would be a really good basis for a movie.
I have to say, I actually partly went into this book project because of the research travel. And I
like that you were upfront about that in the preface. Yeah, I appreciated that. Yeah.
It was totally there. But then COVID happened. And I had to do most of it just in my office. And
in your mind.
And CNC culture was the place I dreamed about the most and would have ideally still want to go. I mean, you mentioned Pirates of the Caribbean. These are pirate seas still. And it's a very interesting way in which there's a kind of essence of modern empire in the anti-pirate activities in exactly the same locations where ancient stuff happened.
We'll get to that with the second chapter. For the moment, though, there's a passage that we talked about in advance about the cave. I was hoping you might also be able to read that one out for listeners.
Such a cosmopolitan experience was eased by the nature of the site and its divinity. As a natural cave rather than a constructed space, Hock fell outside the bounded particularities of any of the merchants' religious traditions. The graffiti suggests that all trading groups could share in this pre-social environment. The cave's columns and ornaments offered intimations of a universal architecture, hinting at the pre- or post-human. It's surely significant that no deity was invoked by name in any of the inscriptions. The Indian visitors, who belonged to all the major religious communities of Western India, Vaishnava, Shaiva, and Buddhist, specified no object of worship. The Palmyrene wooden tablet addressed only, quote, to the god who installed me here. In the longer and somewhat awkward Greek inscription, Septimius Peniscus, the Nauklaros, knelt before the gods and those of the cave, once more leaving the deities unidentified. The incense burners indicate the offering up of frankincense and myrrh, the very materials that the merchants were trading. The heavy scents in enclosed space presumably contributed to Hock's unworldly holiness. In sum, the cave and its unnamed god seem to have offered its visitors the commonality not of transcendent abstraction or syncretized pantheons, but of the archetypal and the eternal. It's difficult to recover how the Hock cave would have impacted the ancient traders who penetrated its darkness. They already belonged to a frontier world operating by habits of coexistence, mixed crews, foreign goods, and multicultural ports of trade, as we've seen. Yet the cavern suggests an especially acute site of cosmopolitanism. At 2 kilometers into the island's limestone, and in the still time of its geology, amid a sketch flotilla of boats and the polyglot names of earlier traders, where one could not tell in torchlight, and perhaps it would not matter, if a graffito had been inscribed 3 years or 3 centuries ago. Nothing indicates a competitive or antagonistic mode of sharing this space. It may not be too naively utopian, and in any case, what better location for such thoughts than a mid-sea island in an ocean long associated with a historical utopian sensibility? To suppose that, at least within the cave space, the individual trader felt himself aggregated to a wider community and anticipated by previous foreign selves. We have already seen intimations of this in the account of Eudoxus's exploratory voyages. In this sense, the Hock cave achieves a kind of symbolic encompassment for an oceanic world without a true navel of the sea.
Well, thanks for that, Paul. And I mean, if we move from this navel of the sea, this kind of place without a sender, this almost sort of transcultural heterotopia, And if we sort of move from that into the second chapter, where you talk, as you framed it in the introduction, about how the shoreline provoked and resisted territorialization. I mean, I guess I'm interested in linking up your rubric of wreckers who, in another way, really subvert the attempted imposition of order and boundary and stateness and all those kind of markers of civilization onto the coastline. So could you explain a little bit what you mean by this concept of wreckers? I have to say this was new to me, and I thought it was a very exciting section of the book.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, sort of love wreckers, love lighthouses. The longer I've lived in America, so I sort of miss the castles of Europe, but lighthouses seem to me like the equivalent. So this second chapter, so the first chapter is about a sort of cosmopolitan world of connection and how the shore links people up. The second one is about competition. Who owns the shore? Who has the capacity to command it and order it? And this is sort of at two levels. One part is at the level of interstate competition. That's the competitions between sovereigns or states. It's kind of diplomatic and legal history with these really remarkable continuities from the Bronze Age forward. So from the tablets of Ugarit to Roman law and afterwards. The second form of competition is that between expansionary inland and hegemonic states and the inhabitants of the coast who fall within the territory claimed by them, with attempts to sort of incorporate, govern, master, make legible these coastal communities. And if the first kind of competition is a kind of diplomatic history, this kind is, I would say it's a version of the history of enclosure, of these attempts to, I guess, to quote the new coastal history, the modern new coastal history, to harden and desavage the shore. Wreckers are populations who wreckers and also pirates are populations who fall between the state and the sea in kind of the crags and the gaps and resist these attempts. It's like what the fish eaters would have been if the Southern Sea was not a sovereignty void. So one of the chapters looks at various symbolic forms of dominance. And one of them I was particularly interested in is the lighthouse, because it's a very strange kind of monument. It's a monument, it's a construction built not in the interests of those who are inhabiting the coast at that very point, who in fact benefit from shipwreck and from the kind of the economic value of things being washed ashore, but it's of the interest to sailors on the water and inland states, some distance from the coast. And the lighthouse, although there are sort of antecedents to it in the archaic period of Greek history, it really takes off in the Hellenistic world. And it's this monument that is built to simplify the coast, codify, undo the basic characteristics of the coast as a site of danger, unpredictability, invisibility. And in its unification of salvation and order and sovereignty, they're always built by important notables or by states. I think there's a kind of political theology visible, the equation of light and safety. There's no accident that so many lighthouses became church belfries in late antiquity. Wreckers are local populations who push back on this movement, and they can do it in two ways. One way is to extinguish the lighthouse light, and so to lure ships onto rocks. Or the other, even more deadly and more frequent in antiquity, is to set up artificial lights. All lights are right. To set up fake lighthouse lights on dangerous shores to kind of lure boats into their devastation and then take the benefits. In the book, I read this as a kind of structural pushback and resistance to the claims of the coast, and in some sense even like a parody of the workings of centralized states.
So it's like land-based piracy almost. It's like you don't even have to get on a ship to get the cargo of a shipwrecked ship, but you could just make it come to you.
Yeah.
If you get it wrecked. Yeah.
Yeah, in some sense. And obviously from the perspective of those who've given us ancient writings, so the elite, the people who sail on the ships or belong to the inland states, this is as barbaric as you can get. And
yeah, it's pretty mean.
Yeah, it's not nice. And there's an incredible continuity from when it first appears when we first have evidence for it in antiquity, right up to really to the 19th century. And in the books chapter, when I deal with this issue, I actually took a painting, an amazing, very bizarre late 18th century painter called Delutheberg, who has this astonishing depiction of wreckers. It's just called the shipwreck, as the jumping off point for the discussion, because there are so many patterns of historical rhymes in this.
Listeners, will put the painting on Instagram.
The overwhelmingly dramatic shipwreck of 1793, now housed in the Southampton City Art Gallery, by the Alsatian-born painter, inventor, and faith healer Philip de Lutherberg. And sidebar, he's just a completely fascinating guy, captures well the classic image of wreckers, modern and ancient. A three-masted ship, foundering in a tempest, has run aground on brutal rocks. A lighthouse towers above, grandly monumental, castle-like, clearly modelled on the Alexandrian Pharos, but its warning beacon has been extinguished. In the foreground, illuminated for judgment by a break in the clouds, pitiable survivors of the wreck, having battled the virtuosic breakers to drag themselves ashore, are being bludgeoned to death by local coast dwellers. The vectors of hierarchical order and state authority, ship and lighthouse, broken and dark, have surrendered to the horrors of the deep and the barbarism of the shore. The hostility of certain coastal peoples to those wrecked on their beaches was a familiar trope of ancient myth, geographic description, and historical narratives. Shipwreck victims were sacrificed by the Taurians of the Black Sea, offered to Ares by Libyans, abused by the Thracians of Salmydessus and Bithynia, immolated in the Scythian style by the Achaea of the Caucasus coast, castrated by the Colobi near the Bab el-Mandeb, enslaved by the Canritae of the Red Sea, kidnapped by the Bukoloi of the Egyptian Delta, and no doubt the casualties of countless other violences, including tattooing. Faithless, lawless, and kingless, coastal peoples must have taken advantage in whatever way seemed locally appropriate of their sea-fallen victims, just as they benefited from the salvage of shipwrecked flotsam and jetsam. But more distinctive and more thoroughly intertwined with the workings of shoreline sovereignty were those coastal groups who would go further, deliberately engineering nighttime shipwreck by manufactured deception. Such wickedness could be summoned in two ways, by darkness and by light.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. I think with that, maybe we could move into the third chapter, which we haven't, unfortunately, we don't have much time for, but I do think that, there's a sense of, I think in that painting, in your description of it, there's an evocation, there's the sort of terror of the sublime to it. And in your third chapter, you discuss the ways in which, indeed the coast has, in antiquity in particular, was a site that tended to provoke sort of wonder and questioning about really the nature of the universe, about, scientific phenomena, about the way that the cosmos works. And, perhaps you could just say a bit about this, really, I think, fascinating and unique take on the significance of the shoreline.
Yeah, so this was definitely the chapter that was the hardest to write and felt most distant from anything I'd previously done. It felt, in many ways, almost, at the end of it, almost like I jumped out of history. Mm-hmm. I've not worked on really myth and poetry before in their own terms. And so it was kind of an adventure, but it probably is my favorite part of the book now, if I can say that. So I was very interested in essentially, what does the coastline make you feel? How transhistorical is that feeling? If I essentially come to the position that I think before the shore, much of us does remain unchanged. Or rather there's a meeting between a sort of very historically situated world and one that escapes that, one that is beyond. So yeah, in that chapter, I'm interested in how the shoreline is simultaneously both the site and the object of a kind of concentrated thinking on the cosmos and our often insignificant place within it. And I do that firstly through studying sort of coastal myths, or often myths of creation, like how does the world come into place, and the shoreline is like this sort of tear.
Yeah, it's really struck me that it's this cosmogonies and also these eschatological predictions, reflections.
Whether it's the Earth and the land emerging out of total sea, or, in the Christian tradition, but the Second Temple Judaism, and in one of the Aesop stories, if the world emerges with all sea and no land, it will end with all land and no sea. And so this was, the shoreline represents a kind of middle, unfinished history that we're now living in.
Because there's a sense also from the Aesop that it would end up in all land, and we can't have that either. We definitely can't have that.
Yeah, I would go so far as to say, I think sort of do in this chapter, that the shore is where our basic understanding of the cosmos is made up of different elements side by side. This kind of flag of elements you get at the shore, land, water, sea, coexist, rub up against each other in hugely productive ways. But it's not just, so the myths kind of throw you back in time. And I also wanted to think of the shore as a sort of observation point from which you can stare deep into the past and into the future through, it's the place probably where landscape change is most visible. You get prehistoric beaches located in antiquity far inland, people discovering, shells and fish in the mines of Egypt and various other places. Tides I've talked about a bit. I was interested in big space, the way that the shore, standing on the shore, implicates you very consciously, if you think about tides, in a kind of full planetary understanding, the totality, the unity of the earth, but then also leaping up to the sun and the moon that are very quickly identified as the main motors of the tidal movements. But then back to the Lutherberg, I ended the book with a discussion with strong association between the shore and death. Represents some kind of limit. It's obviously a site of transition, but it's also one of finitude and marking out the limits of humans. It's where dead bodies wash up. It's where tombs are located. And I was especially interested in how, again, in the Hellenistic period, for whatever reason, this new genre of Nauagika poetry, of poetry to the shipwrecked dead, develops both in kind of poetry books and on actual tombstones.
Could you maybe read a passage from the book about that particular genre, which unfortunately in recent years has, some very modern resonances?
Absolutely. So I treat this poetry first as a kind of poetry of bad death, of grief without mourning, because, it's the dead are sundered from their family, or the bodies are lost, or you can't fulfill the kind of necessary rituals. But then I was also interested in it as not just a lack, but developing something else. Ideas of mutuality and substitution, and of the kind of common literal identity that we've already seen in the hot cave. In each case, the grief that is articulated in these poems, while not directed at a family member or known associate, is also not an impartial sympathy for a generic humanity. It goes beyond the gnomic consolation that death is common to all, even if this recurs on funerary epitaphs. It is the closer fellowship of shore folk, a drawing shoulder to shoulder with those of like experience and similar expectation, that makes this sympathy practical. The washed-up corpse represents not only an ethical charge, but also a possible future for oneself or one's loved ones. While these shipwreck deaths were undeniably characterized by specificity, individuality, and contingency, in ways very different to the predictable patterning of a normative good death, they nonetheless generated a transvocal community of grief. There's a strong sense in these epigrams of the fundamental identity of different shorelines and coastal labor. We're not at all far from the dynamics of the hot cave on Socotra, with its imagined unity of the coastal rim, not so much a circle of frogs round a pond as of mourners on the strand. The ancient Greek funerary epigram, in its calling out to the passerby, sought temporarily to convert a stranger into a friend. The washed-up beach dead extended this obligation of hospitality to its maximal articulation. In this space of relatively unstructured human interrelatedness, with a distant state and absent kin, there was a strikingly open grievability of bodies on the beach, an acknowledgement both of a common corporeal vulnerability and a fundamental relationality. We may compare this to other non-kinship solidarities that have formed themselves at social and physical margins, the gay families of choice that substitute for birth families lost through rejection, the local doctors and pathologists who offer dignified burial to expired refugees at the political boundaries of global north, and the medical staff who gave comfort to dying COVID victims traumatically sundered from loved ones by early pandemic regulations. Put another way, the shoreline was not simply a site of lack, an anarchical space of failed ritual. Rather, the confrontation with beach death and the attending to the tombs of the shipwrecked dead, both in real coastal landscapes and as explored by the Nauagaka epigram collection's coastal walk, evoke a sense of human kindness. In this space of asymmetrical and non-contractual ethics, we see the self-conscious emergence of something approaching the bare, unaccommodated man. I'm reminded of the post-Shoah ethics of Emmanuel Levinas. Quote, I think that the human consists precisely in opening oneself to the death of the other. I'm persuaded that around the death of my neighbor, what I have been calling the humanity of man is manifested.
Well, thank you, Paul. I mean, I think it's no coincidence that the end of the book in this chapter about how the shoreline has prompted contemplation of the cosmos and our place within it brings us back to the first body chapter's rubric of our discovery of likeness amongst humanity. I have, I guess, just two more questions for you. And the first is, do you foresee a sequel? Does this book open up any room for a sequel titled The Ancient Interior?
Not The Ancient Interior, but I am interested in another kind of hyper-object or another relationship between politics, science, and environment. I'm quite interested in the atmospheric sky, weather, and not climate, which has been really well historicized and pulled into the kind of directionality of good ancient history, but kind of the quotidian, unpredictable weather of storms and rain and sunshine and warmth and rainbows, and how to historicize that and make sense of it.
Well, I was actually just thinking I'd like to read a book by Paul on this because as we record this, it's a very blustery day here in New England.
It's incredibly hard to pin down with historical method. So I think, like this past project, to kind of simultaneously be about that and also a thinking through of historical method.
Yeah, that would be great. Well, you're in striking distance of Mount Washington, some of the weirdest weather on Earth.
Is that maybe right?
I think they've recorded the highest wind gusts on Earth at the summit of Mount Washington. It's totally wild up there.
Okay.
Yeah. So maybe, I don't know, another research trip. You can stay at the observatory there. Okay. And then I guess my second question and the final question is that with this, I've been asking guests at the end to, given the sort of state of the world lately, to share with listeners something that you have been doing or reading or watching or whatever that has been bringing you some joy lately.
So I was recently persuaded into starting to listen to books on Audible instead of reading them. Not least because I guess the kind of thing I can do when I'm doing chores for my kids. And my friend Sam encouraged me to listen to Thomas Mann's Joseph and His Brothers. It's absolutely huge book. It's stunning. I'm completely swept up in it.
Well, great. Okay. Well, thank you, Paul. Congratulations on all the success of your wonderful book. And thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much. This was a real pleasure, a treat.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Lesche podcast. And special thanks for their support of the podcast to the Brown University Department of Classics and the John Nicholas Brown Center for Advanced Study. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. And we'd be grateful if you take a moment to rate the podcast and leave a review. It will help other listeners to find us. We look forward to you joining us again soon here in the Lesche.